Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode of ECI Impact 2023. I'm just going to ask our guests to introduce themselves. Sally?
Hi, Sally Yates.
David Ogden.
Andrew Weissmann.
What I really wanted to ask you guys is something Andrew talked about. We did a fireside chat yesterday, which was the evolution of thinking in the Department of Justice in the fraud section around FCPA or other white-collar issues, and how you build upon prior administrations, prior deputy attorney generals, obviously the Yates memo, if I can call it that, and how...
I'd rather you call it the individual accountability memo, but I think I've long since lost that battle.
Yes. But nothing happens in a vacuum, and the really apolitical nature of FCPA enforcement. So if I could just start with that question, and maybe Andrew, you could start with how you helped explain to me the FCPA pilot program became the corporate enforcement policy, and we had changes to that here in 2023.
So under Loretta and Sally, there were a whole series of changes to corporate enforcement. As Sally mentioned, the individual accountability memo, which even I refer to as the Yates memo. Sorry. And also trying out different ways to try to encourage companies to be better corporate citizens, to encourage compliance officers to look to the department in terms of guidance. So there was the FCPA pilot project. As the name suggested, it was done as a test and within the FCPA unit of the fraud section. And that's something that, among other policies that started at that time, it's really been great to see different administrations build on those policies, as they should. I analogized it to, my family's very scientific, and so like with science, you expect scientists to build on other discoveries, and so it's been really great to see through different administrations that policies evolve and grow and become more entrenched within the department.
No, I think that's right, and I think sometimes you also need to learn from the implementation of the policies, and sometimes they need tweaking. You can have unintended consequences from a policy, and so it shouldn't be something that's static and it's written in stone and it stays that way forever. DOJ should and does learn from the implementation of those policies and adjust according to the outcome that they're trying to achieve.
David, one of the themes, it seemed to me, is DOJ is trying to encourage companies to step forward and self-disclose in a variety of ways by increasing the potential credit, by making a declination the default to start with. How would you assess those moves by the DOJ going forward?
Yeah, I think the department has done good things, really, as both my colleagues have said, over the last 8-10 years to really try to align incentives between the department and corporate America on compliance generally. I think voluntary disclosure is hard to get companies to do. It's an action that in the immediate moment is against interest, and you have to really make clear that there are real benefits to doing so and detriments to not doing so. And I think the department has taken important steps in that direction. I think the continuing challenge is to really communicate that there's a real difference, because you really have to encourage those voices internally within a company that want to do the right thing, whether it's voluntary disclosure, whether it's instituting an effective compliance program and devoting the resources to it. It has to be clear to corporate leadership that is not just the right thing to do ethically, but actually a beneficial thing to do. And so I think these policies are evolving in that direction, and I think it's great, because I think that's really what's needed.
Sally, the words you said about the evolution, I've always been on the civil side of things, and I've been in this field since about 2007. So I've seen the Department of Justice evolve in its thinking, and that has impressed me because I didn't know if they were getting input, but it was clear someone was communicating to them these things need to be changed, or at least they need to be considered. Would that be a fair assessment of how things worked, at least when you were the Deputy Attorney General?
Oh, sure. You want to get input from the defense bar, from agencies, from prosecutors out in the field. I spent most of my career at DOJ out in the field, and we had this feeling that sometimes those folks in D.C. could write policies that bore no reasonable relationship to what actually happens in the real world. And so getting feedback of how you actually implement something like this day to day and what's working, what isn't, is really essential. And you have to have an open mind and be willing to say, we should have adjusted this, or sometimes even we were wrong about this, and be able to change.
David, what about your thoughts on this sort of continuing dialogue, if I can call it that?
I think it's critically important, really for the reasons that Sally just said. You need to have all of the field elements of the department that do the work of the department engaged in making policy, and you have to understand how it lands. You have to hear from industry. Because I think there's a natural adversarial relationship that exists there. But at the same time, there is a common interest in compliant behavior that the department can encourage and that corporate leadership can encourage. And so I think feedback in the process is critical. And I give the department credit for having that dialogue, because I think it matters. And it is the defense bar, and it's also leadership of the industry.
Andrew, if I could ask you, what is that dialogue like from the position of the head of the fraud section as opposed to a different position in the Department of Justice?
So the fraud section has somewhat of a unique position, not just because the FCPA program is housed there in terms of DOJ policy, but in terms of white-collar economic crime prosecutions, it's the largest group of prosecutors, so there's a lot of expertise at Main Justice. I, like Sally, also when I was in the field, thought if I never hear from Main Justice, that's a good day. There's just a natural tension. But I do think when it comes to corporate policy, having expertise is really useful. Most U.S. attorneys' offices still do not do corporate cases. They may do individual cases, and that leads to wide differences in the field as to how corporations are treated, how they're seen. One quick anecdote is I remember when we were working with a U.S. Attorney's Office, the line I used to say, who was excellent, said this corporate actor is a recidivist and has a long criminal history. And they had 2 SEC violations in their past over the last, I think, 30 years. And of course, we were thinking this is one of the cleanest companies we've ever seen, and because we had such a history of seeing so many cases. So I do think that the fraud section can be very helpful in providing that perspective, and I think it's useful for companies and the defense bar to have that as a resource. And I think it's also a place where it's a good think tank for coming up with policies because of that expertise.
Sally, David, and Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.